30, verse 25 through 31, verse 16. Life is full of injustice. One of the places where we find a lot of injustice is in financial matters. It would be nice if we never had to worry about being taken advantage of financially. If a boss would always pay an employee exactly what that employee was worth, would give them a fair wage, and if employees would always work hard and not take advantage of their boss, it would be nice if we lived in a world where no one ever bought and sold something for an unfair price and never cheated anybody. But what if God could just intervene when people were cheated? What if he could just intervene and even out the odds? I can think of a couple of times when he did intervene in a very personal and dramatic way. Now we can look at the scriptures and see, like in the book of Judges, for example, there were injustices in the land. And God would send a judge, kind of like an equalizer, is the way those judges were. And they would come and they would judge the enemy. Samson is the example, the big strong man. And he would beat up the Philistines and drive them out and defend the defenseless Israelites. So that was a situation where God intervened. He sent that just judge, or that imputer of justice, you might say. But there was a much more personal way when God stepped in, when people were doing an injustice. At the time of Jesus, a bunch of crooks had set up tables in the temple. They were exchanging money and they were taking advantage of people. And God stepped in a personal way. In the personal person of Jesus Christ, he came in, he tipped over the tables, and he drove the people out of the temple. He wanted to right an injustice because he knew it was wrong. Do you ever wish God would just do that more? You turn on the news and you find all the injustice in the world. There are times he does. There are times it takes time. Some of you may remember times of war and some of the injustices that those wars were fought over. Many of our forefathers lived through the time of World War II. Very dramatic situation where a man was doing injustice. A man named Hitler. Very powerful man, and there was injustice. We sit there and we wonder, why did God let that go on so long? But we also need to sit back and say, God only let it go on so long. He stopped Hitler. Aren't we glad for that? If you start reading history, you find out that some of the battles were won simply because of a change in the weather. You can't discount God's role in righting injustices. In today's lesson, we will not see God coming in a personal way like he did in the temple and overturning tables. Laban is the guy who's doing the injustice. And God doesn't come and beat up Laban. Okay? Sometimes you kind of wish God would just do that. But he doesn't. He doesn't come and beat up Laban. Instead, he rights the injustice. And he does it through the powers of the universe. Through the natural creation that God had established. As we look at this, we're going to see how God really is in control. It is a reminder that God does see what is going on. He does care about justice. And with that in mind, we should commit to doing what's right and make sure we're not the ones doing the injustice. But the main focus of the message this morning that I really want us to grab a hold of is, number one, don't do the injustice. But number two, if you are the recipient or the victim of the injustice, the challenge is the same to you. Do what is right and don't do further injustice. When we come to this message, we're going to see Jacob facing injustice. And we're going to see God setting things right. And we're going to see Jacob doing what God says to do. When we face injustice, trust God and do what Jesus tells you to do. That's what I want us to take out of the message today. When you face injustice, trust God and do what Jesus tells you to do. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us as we start to dig into this passage, that we look at it verse by verse. Help us to understand what you want us to learn from this passage. But then help us to live out the commands to love you and to love others, so that we not impose injustice, but rather that we do what is right. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's remember, Jacob had been tricked by his father-in-law, Laban. He had wanted to marry Rachel, and he had agreed. They had essentially negotiated his wages. Laban wanted to get some labor out of Jacob. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, Laban's daughter. So they agreed. Jacob would work for 7 years, and he would get to marry Rachel. Well, Laban instead tricks him and has him marry Leah, the older daughter. He says the older has to be married first. And then he goes, well, you can still marry Rachel, but you got to put in another 7 years. Now, they had already agreed to the terms. Now, if he says you got to marry Rachel first and then you can marry Leah, I think the upright thing would have been to say, well, you can marry both daughters for those 7 years. Now, we looked at last week why polygamy has so many issues where we shouldn't encourage multiple wives at all. But if that's what Laban was going to do, the upright thing would have been just to say, okay, you're going to marry both daughters. Or to talk to him ahead of time and get that agreement. Not to manipulate the situation so he gets 14 whole years of labor out of the guy. So we find out that Laban is a little bit of a jerk. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say it. But really, that's what it comes down to. Laban is a little bit of a jerk. Eventually, those 14 years are fulfilled, and Jacob wants to get back where he'd grown up in Jerusalem. So he's worked for Laban for 14 years, so he's free to leave now. So we come to Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 and 26. Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me depart for you. For you yourself know my service, which I have rendered you. Evidently, Laban had been pleased with Jacob's work. And he would like to have Jacob stick around a little longer. Essentially, Jacob has become his ranch foreman. And he's managing the ranch pretty well. It's a sheep ranch, a goat ranch. And yeah, Jacob's doing a good job. He doesn't want to lose his foreman. So he offers him additional wages if he'll stick around. So Jacob decides, okay, I'm going to make him an offer that I think is fair. And Laban accepts the offer. Verses 27 through 34. But Laban said to him, if now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account. In other words, he's observed, he's figured it out, that he's being blessed because he's got a good foreman on his ranch. And God's blessing Jacob, and God's blessing Laban in return. He's making money because Jacob's around. He doesn't want to lose Jacob. It's verse 28. And he continued, name your wages and I will give it. But he said to him, you yourself know how I have served you and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turn. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? So you get what Jacob's saying here. He's saying, look, Laban, I've made you rich. But, it'd be nice if I could earn a little bit for my own household, for my own family, and not just make my boss rich, but that I could start to accumulate a little wealth for myself as well. Not an unreasonable request. Verse 31, so he said, what shall I give you? This is Laban saying, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And such shall be my wages. See what he's doing? He wants to work on commission. If you're doing a good job and you're bringing in a lot for your boss, there are advantages to work on commission. Now, sometimes the commission is set up so it's really in favor of the boss. Sometimes it's more in favor of the employee. Sometimes it's fair. And Jacob is saying, I want to work in a commission, but he's not talking about a percentage basis. He wants to have a certain color of livestock. He's doing something a little bit original here. But he's also doing something that can help to give him his wages. Because if God wants to bless Jacob, all he has to do is allow the right colored livestock to be born. And who determines the color of the livestock? Now, I have an agricultural degree. We had to take classes on crop breeding, livestock production. Those are some of the science classes I had for my associate degree in agriculture. And we learned about breeding. We learned about how to get different characteristics. So, for example, if you want to breed tall corn, you breed out the genetic material for short corn, so you get tall corn. All those sort of things you can do through creative crop production, through genetics. What's interesting is not a lot was known about genetics before Mendel did his research on peas. This was after the time of Christ, not from the time of Jacob. Now, maybe they knew more at the time of Jacob and lost some of that information. I don't know. But it was a groundbreaking research with Mendel and figuring out how you could get characteristics with peas. Today, we also understand that if you want a black dog rather than a white dog, you probably want either the mother or the father to be black, and preferably both. You'll be more likely to get a black dog. So even in pet breeding, you understand a few of these concepts. These concepts are all going to come into play. So Jacob is making this proposal. Verse 32 again. Let me pass through your entire flock, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, which shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come concerning my wages. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and the black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen. And Laban said, Go, let it be according to your word. By the way, this is really smart of him. Because we already found out Laban's kind of a jerk. He's looking out for himself. And so if they had agreed on a percentage, what would have happened if a lion or bear had come in and killed some of the sheep? Well, Laban would have said, well, that was your percentage to kill, not mine. I don't know for sure he would have said that, but it could potentially have been that way. Or if a lion and bear come in and they kill some white sheep, some black sheep, and some speckled goats, and some not speckled goats, whatever's killed is killed, whatever lives is lives. But when you go on a percentage basis, you got to try to figure out who has to take the loss. Do we share that loss as a percentage? Or is all the loss Jacob's because he's the foreman in charge of it? Or is all the loss Laban's because Jacob's still supposed to get his share? I mean, all those things are things that could have been argued about and debated about. But when he says, no, this color's mine, that color's yours, we come to divide them up, there's going to be no question. That's the way you deal with somebody that's a little bit shady. Really a good approach when you stop and think about it. Rather than letting a percentage be his wages, he is letting God determine what this percentage will end up being by how many speckled, spotted, and black are born. You see, Jacob is really trusting God in this matter. There's going to be some genetics that come into play. But even in that, you're going to see at the end why it was God who was really being trusted, not just Jacob's clever breeding practices. Laban, however, wants to tip the balance of the scales of justice. I already told you what I would have expected him to do if he had just done a percentage basis. I don't know for sure that Laban would have done that, but he's kind of got a track record. And this matches up with his track record. He removes all the speckled and spotted and black from the flock so that Jacob will be less likely to get more of those. Now, even though they don't have all the fancy genetics that Mendel had, they understood the basics, just like you and I do. That if you've got a black dog and you want black puppies, you want that black dog to be involved in the breeding program. Or if you don't want any black puppies, you don't want any black dogs around at all. That's what they understand. It's pretty basic genetics, but most of us already understand that. That was one of my favorite parts, by the way, about raising pigs. I used to have a farrow and finish operation when I was in high school. I had mama pigs and daddy pigs, and I had all kinds of different colors. And it was so fun just to see what colors of baby pigs, because I had multiple boars, multiple daddy pigs, and I could usually tell which one was the daddy. And I had some red-colored sows, and I had some black and white striped boars. And it was so fun when those red sows would give birth to these little red and white. They looked just like the dad, except instead of black, it was red. You understand what's going on with all these colors, and it's fun. So get that picture. But then imagine all the colored are out of there, and it's just white goats and white sheep. And there's no speckled or spotted or black daddy sheep. And all the mommy sheep are white. And all the daddy sheep are white. And Laban has taken the colored ones that have all these fancy colors, and he's taken them days and days journey away so that they can't mix. That's the situation we have here. In verse 35. So he removed on that day the striped and spotted male goats and all the speckled and female goats, every one with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep, and gave them unto the care of his sons, and put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Laban has interfered, but Jacob has a plan to still get justice if God will allow it. He seems to understand the basics of genetics that we've talked about. The colored sheep would be less likely without the sheep that Laban had removed. But I want us to remember back to when Jacob had first come to this area 14 years earlier. Remember when he first saw Rachel coming? They were by this well. Remember he had to roll that stone away to water the flocks? And remember what they had told him? Why they couldn't roll the stone away earlier? He's like, hey, we got to roll this away, get these sheep watered. It's hot in the day. And he says, no, that isn't our custom here. We wait till all the flocks are gathered together. Then we roll the stone away. That is very key to understanding what happens next. Laban and his sons have taken the sheep that are colored 3 days journey away. They're not around. But remember, the neighbors' flocks are around. And every day that they water them, they all come together. Laban has no right to separate out the speckled and the spotted from the neighbor's sheep. Keep that in mind. Verses 37 through 39. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the gutters, even in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink. And they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Notice what he's saying there? He wanted them to mate when they came together to drink. Now, I don't know exactly what he's doing by peeling that bark. I don't know if, there's certain things you can do to stimulate animals to come into heat all at the same time. There's certain theories that something like that was happening. It's very possible that he was just trying to attract them all to the water trough at the same time with something that made the water flavorful or enticing, so that the neighbor sheep were coming to drink at the same time his sheep were coming to drink, so that the flocks intermingled for a little bit, so that they would do the breeding while they're waiting to drink. I don't know exactly what was involved there, but it could have been as simple as that. And the sheep know the voice of the shepherd. So typically what would happen is when they'd leave the water, then the shepherd would walk and he'd call the sheep and they would follow. And then the flocks would separate their different directions. But as they came together at that water trough, there could be some breeding taking place, and you could have some colored sheep introducing their genetics to Laban's flock. Very, very clever on Jacob's part. Very clever. Where do you think you get an idea like this? I want you to keep asking that question, because we're going to find out at the end of the chapter. Let me just tell you, when you face injustice, trust God and do what Jesus tells us to do. Jacob is just doing what's right. He's not stealing from Laban. He's just watering flocks. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind. When you face injustice, keep those 2 points at the forefront of your mind. Do what's right. Jacob's job was to take care of these flocks. Make sure these flocks are healthy. Make sure they're watered. Make sure they're well fed. He's doing the job that he's supposed to be doing. Further, Jacob figured out that through managed breeding times, he could end up with a stronger flock for himself. Verses 40 through 42. And Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face towards the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. And he put his own herds apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Moreover, it came about when the stronger of the flock were mating, that Jacob would place the rods in the sight of the flock in the gutters, so that they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. You see what he's doing here? He wanted them to breed by the water when the stronger sheep were in. But when it was weaker sheep, let them just breed out the pasture. Well, out in the pasture, there wouldn't be as many speckled and spotted and black, because it would have just been mainly Laban's rams, which were white. So if they're feebler, let them breed them. Because he doesn't want feeble lambs. Let them be Laban's. Just let them breed as they're out eating the grass. But when they're really strong, the really strong, healthy ones, yeah, he wants them to be speckled and spotted. So then he would put that stuff in the water, however he did it, that would make them all come together. And there's different theories when he's doing it. My theory is that there was just something that made the water taste good. And all the sheep wanted to run up, and these strong rams from the neighbor's flock, when his sheep are drinking, and he puts them in there, and the strong rams, well, they can push up there, and they'll come and try to get some, and then they'll be around his ewes and breed them. I think it's as simple as that. So Jacob has managed his herd well. But I want to point something out. I've been a farmer, I've been a pastor. One of the things I've learned is when you're raising crops or raising livestock, there are certain management things that you can and should do. For example, we raised sweet corn this year. And we've got some big ears, and they look good. They taste good. They are yielding well. We fertilized it. We were concerned about making sure that the weeds didn't take it over. So we weeded it. We fertilized it. We did the things we were supposed to do. We paid attention to the planting depth. We did a lot of things that were right from a management perspective. Do you know what really made the big difference? When the water came. And we never watered it. God watered it. You know what else made the difference? When the heat came. When the cool came. The weather made more of a difference than anything at all for our yield. And I've seen that through the years. Yes, I can do some real management mistakes that screw things up. I planted some field corn. I planted it too early and the ground was too cold. I had uneven emergence. We got a little bit of that out in the field. It's just a few rounds, so it's not a big chunk. But we saw what happened when I planted too early, when it was too cold. And it was a good experiment just to see how does the ground react. So there's things we can do that make a difference. But the big difference comes by what God does. You know what happened? It started out cold and that stuff didn't emerge from it. But then it got warm and that corn come out and started growing up. And it kind of compensated a little bit. It looks a lot better than it did earlier, even though it doesn't look as good as some of the other stuff. The point is, we are at the mercy of God and the weather. We are at the mercy of the genetics that God created. You know, I talked about Mendel the peas. I talked about my classes on crop breeding and livestock breeding. So we learned all these things. But who created all these things? Jesus is the creator. He created all the goats, all the sheep, all the peas, all the corn. And we've simply built upon that creation through selective breeding. But he created the whole dynamic that allowed us to breed these things. The Creator is the one who's able to step in on Jacob's behalf and right the injustice through his creation. I think it's really neat how God is doing that. He's using his creation and the way he created things to bring justice. Even with good management, you still need God's blessing, though. Especially for Jacob, whose finances depend on having a certain color of animal born. Just because you have a black sheep bred to a white ewe doesn't mean that you're always going to get a black lamb. It does increase the chances quite a bit, though. Things are turning out great for Jacob in spite of Laban's schemes. And Laban and his sons are not pleased. Verses 43 through chapter 31, verse 2. It says, so the man became exceedingly prosperous, that means Jacob, and had large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels, and donkeys. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban, his son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father, he has made all this wealth. And Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly towards him as before. God then tells Jacob it's time to go. Remember, when you're facing injustice, you need to trust God and listen to Christ. God tells him to go. Verse 3, then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. God promises to be with Jacob. Jacob can trust that promise after seeing all the animals God has given him. There's no doubt that Jacob has managed the herds and the breeding program well. But he wants his family to understand something very important. He wants his family not to look at him and say, look, our dad is so clever in knowing how to manage this stuff. Our dad is such a talented rancher. No, that's not what Jacob wants his family to get out of this. He wants his family to get that God has blessed them. That this blessing came from God. God was in charge of those genetics. God was in charge with what those animals would look like. God was in charge with what sheep bred with what other sheep they bred with. Because, Jacob could stimulate them to come to the water, but they still have to come into heat at the right time, come into season at the right time. All the stuff has to come together, and that's part of God's plan in his creation. And his creation was created in such a way that he was able to bless Jacob, and Jacob recognizes that. Verses 4 through 13. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. In other words, come out to the field and see this. And he said to them, I see your father's attitude that is not friendly towards me as formerly. But the God of my father has been with me. I want you to catch that. The God of his father. We're going to find out next week that Laban has a different God. Isaac and Abraham were worshiping the true God. And Jacob recognizes the true God in heaven, the God of his father, has been with him. Verse 6, he says, and you know that I have served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. In other words, it was more than just cheating him out of Leah, or out of Rachel with Leah. It was more than just taking those sheep 3 days' journey away. It says it's changed my wages 10 times. But notice what he says. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. When you're facing injustice, to be able to trust God, and notice God stepped in. That doesn't mean he prevented Laban from cheating Jacob. But notice he blesses Jacob in spite of him being cheated. I can tell you, I got accounts receivable on the business end of my life. People that haven't paid what they should have paid. Okay? But you know what? God has blessed me in spite of that. I've had other people that paid me extra. They said, hey, we love the job you did. Here's some extra. God's able to even that out. Yes, there is injustice in this world, but notice what Jacob says. God did not allow him to hurt me. Then he says in verse 8, if he spoke thus, the speckled shall be your wages. Then all the flock brought forth speckled. And if he spoke thus, the stripe shall be your wages. Then all the flock brought forth striped. Thus, God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. You see what Jacob is recognizing here? He's recognizing God did this. Verse 10, and it came about at the time when the flock were mating, that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream. Why don't you just pause here? The time that the flock are mating. Usually, sheep come in to mating season in the fall of the year. Usually, it has to do with when it gets cold. The temperature in the fall stimulates them to come in to be ready to be mated. During that time, Jacob had a dream. So it's mating season for the sheep, and Jacob has a dream. That's what he's telling us here. I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped and speckled and mottled. That's what it says in verse 10, that he had this dream and he saw the right kind of genetics being introduced to the flock. But notice what it says in verse 11. It says, then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. The angel of the Lord, that's the Lord Jesus Christ. So I want you to stop and think about this. It's having a dream and Jesus is talking to you. It's the pre-incarnate Christ. Jesus was in existence before he was ever born in the manger of Bethlehem. This is years before that. Jesus is in heaven. He came down to earth from time to time. But he has this dream and Jesus is talking to him. Notice what he says in verse 12. And he says, lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. Remember, he saw that ladder to heaven and put a pillar up there back in Bethel? The Lord's telling him, go back there, return. But he's also telling him, look at what's breeding the sheep. He's giving him this idea to have the right colored bucks and rams. The buck goats, the ram sheep, breeding his flock, or Laban's flock, so it becomes his flock. This whole idea comes from God. It isn't just Jacob's idea. Jesus gave him the idea. You notice what happened here? He's facing injustice. He trusts God and he obeys Jesus. I can't guarantee you're always going to be blessed with all kinds of riches when you just trust God and obey Jesus. But it's the right thing to do. Now, I open up the scriptures and I don't find a breeding program other than in this passage. But I do find challenge of our Lord Jesus Christ to love the Lord with your all, to love your neighbors yourself, and so many other commands that we can go through and that we do go through. What does Jesus expect out of us? He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Do what Jesus says to do, whether you're facing injustice or not. And by the way, when you're facing injustice, that's one of the times when we're most tempted to not listen to Jesus and to take matters into our own hands. Am I the only one that feels hurt and angry when I'm faced with injustice? There may be a temptation to do something sinful when you're faced with injustice. We're human. It would not be unexpected for you to have that temptation. But remember, when faced with injustice, trust God and do what Jesus says. Don't sin simply because you're faced with injustice. Do what Jesus says. Do what's right. And to really let this hit home that Jacob was just doing what the Lord had showed him. That these animals were breeding when they were supposed to be breeding. And the right color animals were breeding when they were supposed to be breeding. So now we know where Jacob got his skills for managed breeding. It's from Jesus, the Creator, the one who made these sheep and understood all about them. Rachel and Leah even understand that their dad was not planning to give them anything, but that God had stepped in and blessed them in an amazing way. Verses 14 through 16. And Rachel and Leah answered and said, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned to him as foreigners? In other words, they're recognizing Dad's not going to give us anything. For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our fathers belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. You notice what these sisters are recognizing, Jacob's wives are recognizing? God has taken away this stuff from Laban, their dad, and given it to them and their children. They recognize God has done this. They're saying, God's done this. Obey God. Do what he says. So when God's telling them, go back to Bethel, they're ready to say, yeah, we need to obey God. We can trust God. It's easier to trust God when He's just blessed you. But there's a song, Count Your Many Blessings, name them one by one. The reality is God has blessed us, even though we're in the midst of trials. Jacob had a lot of trials. He had a lot of injustice in his life. And he had a lot of blessing. Knowing that God does bless, even in spite of trials, should encourage us to say we can trust Him. We can do what He says to do. And thankfully, Rachel and Leah are doing that. Listen to God. Trust Him. We're taken advantage of. We can fret. We can hold a grudge. Or we can trust God like Jacob and his wives did. God knew about the injustice and He cared. He doesn't always step in such a dramatic way. But even if He does not right the scales of justice till the next life, we can know that He will. In fact, Jesus told us about that in Luke chapter 16, verse 25. He says, "But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. And now he is being comforted here, and you are in agony.'" Abraham's talking to a rich man who went to the place of torments after he died. Lazarus was a poor beggar who had basically nothing, and he was in a place of comfort. It was in the next life that God was righting the injustices. We can trust God to do that. And if you know He's going to do that, that ought to motivate you to listen to Him and do what He says. Trust God and do what Jesus tells us to do. Love God, love your neighbor, regardless of the injustice you may or may not be facing. I want you to reflect on that for a moment. Injustice is hard to deal with, especially when you got somebody like Laban in your life. I don't know who the Labans are in your life. Hopefully you don't have anybody like that, but if you do, talk to the Lord about it. Ask Him what He would want you to do to react in a godly way. And then trust Him in that. I'll give you a few moments to just reflect on that. And I'd ask God if you'd close us in prayer.